they want to. Talk don't bother me. I want the whole wide world to know that I love you so.
And welcome to Let 'em Talk. I'm Paul DeRienzo.
And I'm Miss Joan Moossy.
And we're here on MNN Channel 56 with our show, Let Them Talk, and where we let you talk and ask questions and participate in the show. Our number is on the screen, 212-757-1538.
So call us up.
Call us up. And joining us on the line is attorney Stanley Cohen, who is an expert on the subject we're going to be discussing tonight, and that's the war on terrorism.
And he wasn't able to be in the studio with us, but he is on the telephone.
And how you doing, Stanley?
I'm doing fine, great. Hi, Paul. Hi, Johnny. How you doing?
All
Well,
right.
Thanks for being here.
Okay, so you have a perch up there in the northern tier of New York State right now, and we've been seeing a lot of headlines about this recent alleged terror threat coming from folks who have been arrested in Canada. A number of people have been arrested. I know that you're not directly involved in this case, but you've seen many of these cases come and go. Is that true?
Yeah, well, I think the only terror threat I'm worried about is the White House. But yeah, this case follows the format that's been used for years in the United States, even before 9/11. Essentially, I think as it turns out that this is a sting. This is a case where Canadian law enforcement must be bored, given the fact they spend most of their time protecting the marijuana industry up there. They essentially found some young kid, or some young kids, testosterone-driven kids, seduced them, talked them into, doing what it is they're alleged to do, and drew a net wider, and they provided the means and the method and the process, and pushed them and shoved them, and never had them off much of a leash. And then when it came politically correct to bust them, they busted them. And then they said, "See, it works. The system works." Well, this is another one of these federal concocted terrorism cases, which have become the rule and not the exception in the United States for about 10 years now.
Are there terrorists? Are there people that we should be afraid of who are out there trying to get in through the borders of the United States, either the northern or southern borders? Or is 9/11 the beginning of this, or is the government lying to us?
The last thing I worry about are people trying to get into the United States. I think people forget that there have been more acts of terrorism carried out in the United States by the so-called Christian right in the last 20 years than anyone else. There have been more people killed and kidnapped, and bank robberies, and judges threatened, and journalists assassinated, and family planning clinics bombed. I mean, I don't worry about people trying to get inside the country. I worry more about, the people that live in our theocracy, who pose a clear and imminent danger and a threat of terrorism if you don't look the way they want you to look, or speak the way they want you to speak, or act the way they want you to act.
So in a way, you're talking about a form of profiling, ethnic, racial profiling.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, profiling is as old as apple pie in this country. It began with North American Indians. It added on to African Americans. It included women, and it shifted over to ethnicities, including Jews and Irish and Italian. Now it's all people of color. It was Muslim and Arab and Southeast Asian. Now we've shifted back to Mexican Americans or Latin Americans, and we seem to. We can't get our act straight on who we want to profile. It's like everyone's a boogeyman unless your name is Meade, Jonathan Meade III, and you're 45 years old and a banker living in Greenwich, although once in a while these guys go down, as the feds have proven recently.
Well, it does help to be middle-aged.
I'm sorry?
It does help to be middle-aged.
Yeah, yes it does. It's one of the perks of surviving.
It is.
Well, haven't there been cases where... I remember we had, on a radio show I was doing, we were interviewing a author who had researched a phenomenon of female suicide bombers, that nobody expected women to be suicide bombers, so then you had a spate of women who were dressing up and walking right through security and doing this kind of thing. Do you see that there is an angry there really are people who are angry with us, with the United States, and who are capable of these kind of acts? Are they out there?
Well, George Bush and his administration has become the greatest recruiting mechanism for so-called terrorism that has been out there for decades. I mean, there are lots of people,
Yeah.
as you well know, both of you, I travel all over the world, especially in the Middle East and Gulf and Southeast Asia. There are lots of people who are angry at the United States government, for good reason often. They're not angry at, I don't hear much anti-American citizen rhetoric. I don't hear many people upset at Americans. In fact, I meet lots of people everywhere that talk about how wonderful American people are, but how, just totally confused and conflicted and angry they are at policymakers in Washington. Look, Abu Ghraib, pales in comparison now to what is obviously the systematic pattern of assassination and torture and terrorism carried out in Iraq. The recent policies of the United States insinuating themselves into and trying to undercut the legitimate elections of the Palestinian Authority is another example. I mean, you don't need to search far to see this government's fingerprint in creating issues that stir the pot and that, understandably so, anger folks wide and far.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to give the phone number out. So if anybody wants to call in, it's 212-757-1538. And we'd love to have you join the conversation.
Right, 212-757-1538. I'm Paul DeRienzo with Joan Moossy, and our guest is attorney Stanley Cohen. Stanley, you've covered a lot of cases where folks have been accused of involvement in terrorism. I think the most famous, probably well known, was the former treasurer. I think that's what his position was, or at least he was accused of the organization Hamas.
Well, no. I have represented the head of the political wing of Hamas since
Yes.
1995.
What was his name again?
Musa Abu Marzouk.
Marzouk, right.
I still represent him. In fact, I'll see him sometime in the Middle East next week. I've done a lot of cases involving Palestinians, both here and overseas.
And wasn't Marzouk, he was an interesting case because he spent a long time in prison before he was released.
Well, he spent 22 months in jail in the United States. Charges which were concocted by, I loved it, he was arrested allegedly having lived in the United States for 14 years, not a designated organization, not a designated person, but it was at a time when Israel was trying to prop up Arafat, who was, he was seen as competition for Arafat. And so Israel prevailed upon the United States to grab him, to create problems in terms of returning to the United States. And then subsequently, the first time in Israeli history, the Knesset, the parliament, voted and ordered the Attorney General to just issue an arrest warrant against Marzouk, not their criminal justice system. So then the United States began an odyssey of allegedly, they claim, wanting to extradite Abu Marzouk to Israel. We knew Israel didn't want him. They just wanted him isolated, and it took 22 months, and eventually there was a negotiated settlement in which he was returned to Jordan, where he lived for a while, and now he lives in Damascus.
Do you think that in the current atmosphere since 9/11, particularly here in the United States, that Marzouk would have gotten a fair shake, the same outcome?
Well, no. But the one thing that has not changed, in many regards it's becoming even more, is we are political creatures. We are breaking bread with Gaddafi right now. He's one of our good friends.
Sure.
We're doing joint development projects, and as you know, I represented a gentleman named Abdurrahman al-Amoudi who pleaded guilty in Virginia, and the essence, the gravamen of that was he conspired with Gaddafi to murder Prince Abdullah, the head of the family in Saudi Arabia. But that's okay, because George Bush needs Gaddafi, and I'm not suggesting that anything else should have happened, but it's an example of how ultimately in this day and age in this country, it really doesn't matter what you do or what they say you do. What matters is how you fit into the grand geopolitical scheme of George Bush. For years, Indonesia were bad guys. Now we love Indonesia because they're, quote-unquote, helping us in the war on terrorism. President Musharraf of Pakistan, George Bush couldn't even pronounce his name, was on the terrorist list for years. Now he's one of our best friends because he breaks bread with Mr. Bush. So I really don't know how the Marzouk matter would have played out. Certainly what is different is is had they known that at one point they would have loved to end up with Fatah as they are now with Abu Abbas, that they would not have allowed Abu Marzouk to be repatriated back to Jordan.
In other words, you're saying that what is the current position is the Hamas is now in charge of the Palestinian Authority.
Well, Hamas, unfortunately, the Palestinian people took American democratic rhetoric literally.
Well,
They were told, have an election, vote. They voted with their feet, and they had a higher voter turnout under the yoke of Israeli weapons than in the history of the United States. About 80% of people turned out.
We have a call.
65% voted for Hamas.
We have a call,
Stanley,
Stanley.
I wanted to ask you if you were surprised by the results of that election.
Not at all.
Okay.
Okay. We have a call. You're on the air.
Hello?
Welcome to Let 'em Talk.
Hello?
Yes. How you doing?
Can you repeat what y'all talking about, please?
Well, we're interviewing Stanley Cohen, an attorney who's defended many leaders, for example, Abu Marzouk, the political leader of Hamas. He's defended many people who've been accused of crimes having to do with terrorism, and he's a person who feels, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he's a person who feels that the government has been hypocritical in their use of these laws, going after people really to ethnically stereotype them.
Would you like to ask Stanley a question?
Well, what do you think about this?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Would you like to ask a question?
So it is.
Yeah, I guess not. But that's to be
Froze up
expected.
on the air.
Right. He wasn't happy with it. Well, Stanley,
Call back after you think about it a little.
Stanley, you've been,
It's okay.
you've had some, that's actually a great segue in the fact that you, Stanley, have had some negative responses from the community, from certain elements of the community, because of the defense work you've done.
Was that a negative response?
I'm not sure.
No, I think he just froze up on the air.
He froze up, didn't have anything to ask.
Couldn't think of a good question.
But that's still a segue
But
into...
he might, and he can call back.
Okay.
212-757-1538.
But I still want to ask Stanley about, you got a lot of harassment from different groups and things like that. How do you deal with that?
Oh, look, you do what you do. You follow your principles. You fight the good fight. You try to make sure that you're on target, and you pick your battles wisely. People forget. The word terrorism is thrown around so lightly. For some 24 or 25 years, one of the most despised terrorists, alleged terrorists, someone serving decades in jail, was Nelson Mandela. And I'm not saying he should have spent a second. Today, every world leader falls over each other to get a photo op with him. There's generally a fine line between terrorist and freedom fighter, and it's who wins.
Right.
Malcolm X was one of the most despised people in the world, at least in the West, forever. Now there's a postage stamp with his picture on it. So I don't worry about what the cheering section. In fact, as a young man, I learned from a trade union activist from the islands that it's much more important to gauge your success by the people that don't like you than those that do.
I see. Very interesting.
Right.
And, geez, so more I wanted to ask about your experiences, because you've had some fascinating, and it wasn't just folks in the Middle Eastern areas that you've defended and been in cases with. You've had some fascinating, and I was there for some of it. It was a number of years ago, but you did a lot of interesting work with the Mohawk Indians and other Native American, North American groups and defending them in their rights
Yeah,
against...
tell us a little bit about the Oka experience.
Which was 16 years ago, but it's fascinating, and also maybe segue into some of the stuff that you've been doing more recently, if you want.
Well, no, I have represented North American Indians since the mid-'70s, who in many respects strike a similar vein as do the Palestinians and other resistance movements, where in essence these are people that have been colonialized, that have been subjected to genocide, that have been involved in diasporas, and they're struggling to protect their land, to hold on to what little they've got left, to maintain their sovereignty and their beliefs and their traditions. And periodically, it's spilled out into violence. Listen, people, I don't propose it, but nevertheless, people have an absolute right of self-defense and self-determination. Sometimes that involves armed struggle. That's an issue that happened with the Mohawks in Kanesatake, which galvanized, at least for a while, Canadian education and sensitivity in the short term for the rights of what they call the First Nation people. Unfortunately, Canada, which gets a free pass in many respects, which they don't deserve, about being this great progressive country, wonderful human rights records, we're right back into another struggle where they are trying to steal indigenous lands, North American lands, up in a place called Six Nations, and it's given rise to another armed standoff in Quebec once again.
And we have another call, Stanley.
We're going to give it a shot. It's always an adventure here on Let Them Talk. You're on the air.
Hello?
Hello? Caller, you have a question?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Go for it. Go for it.
So what do you think about the stuff that's going on right now?
Well, what in particular? I think we've been talking about a lot of different things. What do you think? Let me ask it that way.
Johnny, get the phone!
Oh, man. Well, we'll give him another chance. Maybe he'll come back with some, with another.
I think he wants to make sure he's not being monitored.
I think that's it, too.
That could be it, right? He really, he just loves us, and he's like very protective. Yeah, so we're talking about the Six Nations. Do you know some of the details of what's been happening in that case? I've seen some headlines, but I haven't been able to make hide nor hair of it.
There's an attempt. Once again, it was Canadian land. It was a Canadian land grab where land that clearly is indigenous, that's owned by the Six Nations people. Developers cut a side deal with the provincial government, and we're moving in to do developments, and the Six Nations people said no.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do this. We don't have a lot left, but whatever we got, we're going to hold on to and fight to hold on to. And it was a armed standoff, and there have been some injuries. Fortunately, no one's been killed which occurred in Oka.
Yeah. How do they do this? Do they just like claim ownership of land that natives say is theirs, and then they say, well, it's ours, they have some legal title to it, and we're going to just start building a golf course or a building?
They have this notion that's comparable to sort of like eminent domain.
Uh-huh.
It's like the guys with the biggest guns get to decide what they want to do with the land.
Well, could you tell us briefly what happened in Oka for the people who
Well, sure.
don't
Oka
know?
it's a small Mohawk community just outside of Montreal, where some local development people had decided they wanted to expand a golf course that was 9 holes into 18 holes, and they were going to do it by bulldozing a traditional, interestingly enough, a traditional Christian Indian cemetery and a very old 400 or 500-year-old pine tree forest.
Beautiful place.
And the women and children in Oka started resisting for about 60 days. It was a standoff, and eventually they sent the SWAT teams in. And the morning they sent the SWAT teams in to clear the women and children so that the bulldozers could take over, there was a armed standoff, and an SQ cop was shot dead.
That's like a state trooper as far as the Canadian province of Quebec.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what happened then was the Canadian Army moved in, and there was a standoff. The Mercier Bridge was shut down, and 3
That's a
Mohawk
major
territories had a
bridge.
standoff that lasted about 4 months.
Right. And in the end, no one was ever convicted of that killing, were they? Or even
Well,
charged with it?
not only was no one ever convicted of the killing, but none of the Mohawks, and the only white person who was indicted in Canada who went to trial on that were convicted either, and that namely was me.
Right, right. You were on. What were you charged with?
Oh, I was basically the counterpart to seditious conspiracy. I found it interesting how an American could be charged with seditious conspiracy in Canada.
Well, what do you think about the Mark Emery case where they're trying to extradite a Canadian to the United States?
I couldn't hear you there.
The Mark Emery case, guy in Vancouver.
Oh, the seed guy.
Yes.
The guy who says selling pot seeds, which are basically legal.
Oh, I think he'll be sowing his seeds for many years before he sets foot in a federal courtroom.
Right.
We have another call now.
We'll try it.
Okay.
All right. Well, we lost him. All right. Well, we'll take it again if they want to call. 212-757-1538. I want to come back in our last few minutes, Stanley, to the issue of traditional terrorism or Middle Eastern terrorism, whatever. The issue of 9/11 in particular. We had a couple of shows where we've had guests who are advocates, and I know there's a conference that was held this weekend in Chicago where many people around the country are challenging and questioning what seems like a foregone conclusion, that a group called Al-Qaeda, led by a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden, rammed planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and killed 3,000 people. Some people are saying, quote unquote, it was an inside job. that this was really an implosion, this was a setup, a rationale, to create a rationale to go to war, to do things they couldn't do, a Reichstag fire. They have their films, they have their evidence, and a tremendous following. What do you think about that theory? Have you given it
I
any
think John Kennedy did it.
You think John Kennedy did it?
I think John Kennedy's really living in a submarine off the coast of Chicago, and he did it.
With Elvis.
I think it's interesting because the big conspiracy theory proponents actually, do the United States government a tremendous disservice on one level, because if Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden didn't exist, the United States would have to create them. But it also does a service because the United States would like nothing better than to restore the myth of invincibility, that we are free to wreak havoc all over the world, and because of two oceans that we can, do what we want, when we want, wherever we want, without any response.
And I guess
Right,
9/11
we've got another
might have
call.
proved that wrong. Yeah, we're going to give it a shot here. Oh, try again, caller. Sorry we didn't get to you.
There
There
you
you
go.
are. All right, you're on the radio. Television.
Hello? Hello. Hello. I got a quick question for you.
Sure.
Great.
What do you think about personal identification cards containing DNA? Do you think that disrupts your civil rights, or do you think that's a good idea?
I think it's
question.
terrible. I think that one of the hallmarks of one of the beauties of the North American, because American, you got to be careful. The United States, history is the fact that we have been able to resist to the degree that we can, in every way that we can, in many ways successfully. This recording system, this mechanism that everyone says, well, it makes it more convenient, it makes it safer. I am completely opposed to identification systems, to national pass card systems, to the use of passports, unless if you want me to, next time I go to a 7-Eleven, ask for my passport. That's fine. I think that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But this notion that we're going to either set up data, the argument that we should use data banks for DNA, or we should use passbook systems because it makes us safer or better, is the same argument that for years law enforcement has used, unsuccessfully, fortunately, by and large, that you shouldn't have a warrant requirement because it protects the guilty. Well, the warrant requirement doesn't just protect the guilty, it protects the innocent. It protects the privacy of people that have a right to be left alone and to have a clear separation between government and their zone of privacy. That's the zone which this government wants to transcend when they start turning us into a system or a country of passbooks and checkpoints and accountability that strikes at the heart of our liberty.
Okay, so you associate like warrants and criminals with people taking, like the government taking innocent individuals' DNA. It's almost as if they're disrupting our bodies, like police going into a house or something like that.
No. What I simply say is there are lots of things that would make the job of this government or the job of law enforcement easier. It would make it, run a little bit better. But they invade a zone of privacy, and you draw a line in the sand and you say tough. There's an old saying I learned 30 years ago in law school that it holds true today. I'd rather have 1,000 guilty people go free than one innocent guy go to jail.
Okay. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. All right, thank you.
All right,
Thank
thanks
you,
for the
caller.
call. Great
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, Stanley. You know what that reminded me of, Stanley? The whole issue of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and FISA. And we've had a discussion about that because, on one hand, now that, the FISA was supposed to be there to protect, citizens from the government going around and trying to find alleged foreign subversive elements within the anti-war movement or within social justice movements, because of course nobody would dare have a movement against social injustice in the United States unless they were foreign influenced. And we know that J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon were looking for communist bugaboos under every bed, so they had to bring in FISA to prevent these kind of broad warrantless searches of people who just happen to have a friend in another country. And now FISA seems to have been thrown out the window entirely, and they're going after people without warrants pretty much at will.
Well, I got to tell you, it's I've litigated the old FISA issues in law for a number of years throughout the United States, various cases, various courts, and what's most disturbing about the whole process is FISA was a vehicle which was designed, which was set up to basically say, look, there are concerns bigger than traditional law enforcement. Because of that, we're going to give the government tremendous flexibility and freedom to interdict acts of terrorism. We're not going to permit them to use this as evidence against people in criminal cases. And the FISA courts, prior to 9/11, I think had like 1,322 applications, and they approved 1,320 warrants, and the next day they approved them. So it worked very well. The fact that 9/11 occurred wasn't because of FISA didn't work. The fact that 9/11 worked wasn't because of poor intelligence. 9/11 occurred because of a lack of intelligence. The people at the watch were stupid. So, you know, this notion that FISA, which already existed and which was supposed to play a very minimal role and was designed to be very flexible for law enforcement, needed to give way to, you know, the mining of every phone call going everywhere is, you know, it's perverse in the extreme. But again, this is an administration that knows to push the rhetorical buttons. They know what buttons to push, they know what to say, they know when to wave the flag, and they get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another call. I think we can squeeze one
We'll
more in.
squeeze one more in. You're on the air. You're
Hello?
on the television. Go ahead.
Hello?
You're on.
Hi,
Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm an easy one. I'm an easy one to fit in. Hi. Hello.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Marjorie.
Oh, hey, Marjorie. How you doing?
All
Welcome.
right, great
Marjorie
to hear
Moore.
from you.
Thank you, Marjorie. You have a question? We only have a couple minutes.
Great show.
Thank you.
Very informative.
Oh, I'm so
Yes,
glad
I
you're
want. Well, the
joining.
question was going to be about China and its relationship to all this.
In what way? Well, we don't have... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, what role is China playing in all this terrorism? Are they just laid back?
I don't know. Have you any interactions, Stanley, in your cases with China in this?
I
Right
think
now?
China and Iran are too busy trying to become the world's leading economic superpowers.
I see.
You know,
That's their interest.
I think, you know, the so-called war on terrorism really has so many, you know, soft sides and double edges because, you know, while we're busy creating and compacting and compounding problems and chasing boogeymen and boogie women around, there are countries in what was Persia and in Asia that are, you know, really moving ahead and developing economic independence and becoming superpowers.
Okay, we're going to have to end now. We're in our last 20 seconds. I'm Paul DeRienzo, Miss Joan Moossy. This is Let Them Talk.
Thanks, Stanley.
Stanley Cohen, Attorney Stanley Cohen, as our guest. A wonderful call from Marjorie Moore. Thank you, Marjorie.
Thanks,
and
Marjorie.
Thank you all for joining us on Let Them, all
Thanks
the
for your
callers.
invitation, guys.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much,
See you
Stanley.
next week.
See you next
Take care.
week.